History is not written only by those who win wars. It is written by those who decide what survives afterward. In the final collapse of the Third Reich, something far more deliberate than retreat took place. As Allied forces advanced, Nazi Germany began erasing evidence, not only of crimes, but of experiments that had crossed scientific, ethical, and strategic boundaries so extreme that even post-war governments chose silence over exposure. What follows is not speculation. It is a reconstruction of what was partially recovered, partially destroyed, and almost entirely buried. It began with classified files, not field reports, not military orders, but scientific documentation marked with security levels that exceeded even standard wartime secrecy. These files did not describe weapons ready for deployment. They described processes, human tolerance thresholds, environmental manipulation, long-term physiological alteration, the kind of research that does not belong on a battlefield, but in sealed rooms with no witnesses. Several Allied intelligence units reported discovering identical filing systems in different locations, suggesting a centralized protocol designed for rapid destruction. The language used in these documents was clinical, detached, and chillingly precise. Subjects were never named, they were numbered. Results were measured not in survival, but in deviation from expected outcomes. One file category appeared repeatedly across multiple sites. It did not specify a weapon, it specified a facility. Deep beneath occupied territory, far from major cities, the Third Reich constructed laboratories that were never listed on official maps. These were not factories, they were not bunkers, they were controlled environments designed to isolate variables: temperature, pressure, sound, radiation, electromagnetic exposure, and to observe long-term effects on the human body. Inside one such facility, Allied investigators found something unusual. The equipment remained, the power systems were intact, but the personnel records stopped abruptly. According to surviving documentation, 63 individuals were transferred into the facility within a single 48-hour period. No exit records existed, no burial records existed, no relocation orders existed. They vanished. The experiments conducted in this facility focused on sustained exposure rather than immediate results. Unlike battlefield testing, these trials were designed to observe gradual transformation, changes in cellular behavior, neurological adaptation, metabolic suppression. The goal was not death, it was endurance beyond natural limits. Subjects were monitored continuously: heart rate, brain activity, hormonal fluctuations. Some records indicated anomalous stabilization, bodies adapting where collapse was expected. This contradicted existing medical models and alarmed even the researchers conducting the work. Then, without warning, all monitoring ceased. The official explanation in post-war briefings claimed evacuation, but evacuation requires documentation, transport manifests, receiving facilities. None were found. The files ended mid-sentence. What happened to the 63 remains one of the most complete disappearances in documented scientific history. As Allied forces continued uncovering similar sites, a pattern emerged. Facilities designed for long-term experimentation were abandoned intact but emptied of people and records. It was as if the experiments themselves had reached a conclusion the architects never intended to disclose. Among the fragments that survived, one anomaly stood out: a medical profile, misfiled and overlooked during initial cataloging. It described a single subject who demonstrated extreme resistance to cellular degradation. Aging markers remained static, recovery rates exceeded baseline human capability. The file ended with a single directive: observation to continue indefinitely. This subject was never listed among the vanished 63. Post-war intelligence interviews reference an individual detained briefly in the late 1940s whose biological markers appeared inconsistent with chronological age. The testimony is vague, names are redacted. The individual was released quietly, no follow-up records exist. Officially, this never happened. The implication, however, was enough to trigger immediate suppression. If even a fraction of the data was accurate, it represented a breakthrough that could not be ethically contained or politically explained.
The Third Reich's obsession with control extended beyond the body into perception itself. Experiments explored how prolonged exposure to controlled environments altered subjective experience of time. Subjects reported disorientation, temporal compression, and in some cases an absence of perceived aging. Whether these reports reflect psychological dissociation or something more remains unresolved. What is clear is that these findings never entered public scientific discourse. As the war ended, Allied scientists reviewing captured materials faced a dilemma. Some discoveries were too dangerous to publish, others were too incomplete to verify. In several cases, joint agreements were reached to seal entire research categories indefinitely. Silence became policy. This was not mercy, it was containment. Facilities were dismantled, remaining subjects were relocated or absorbed into classified programs under new identities. In at least one documented case, a subject was monitored for years without showing expected signs of biological aging. When the monitoring ended, the individual disappeared.
Erasing knowledge does not undo it, it only delays its return. And in the decades following the war, that return began quietly, in places no one expected. Medical journals recorded anomalies that defied accepted aging models. Military research programs revisited concepts once dismissed as impossible. Classified funding flowed into projects whose origins were never publicly acknowledged. The disappearance of the Third Reich's experiments did not end their influence, it redistributed it. Former Nazi scientists absorbed into Allied programs brought more than technical expertise. They carried methodologies, ways of thinking about experimentation that prioritized results over limits. While the ideological framework was stripped away, the procedural logic remained: controlled isolation, long-term exposure, incremental escalation. These methods quietly shaped Cold War research culture. Officially, none of this was connected. Unofficially, patterns repeated. One particularly sensitive category involved human performance optimization. Post-war programs explored endurance, resistance to environmental stress, and altered metabolic states. While these initiatives claimed defensive or medical goals, their structural similarity to earlier Nazi research was unmistakable. The same variables, the same metrics, different names. What had been erased from history was not the knowledge, but its moral context. In several cases, oversight committees halted projects abruptly, citing ethical violations without elaboration. Files were sealed, funding disappeared, researchers were reassigned. The public never learned what triggered these decisions, only that certain lines of inquiry were suddenly deemed unacceptable. This silence mirrors the original erasure. The missing 63 subjects continued to haunt investigators. Over the years, attempts were made to cross-reference their identification numbers with post-war refugee records, prisoner transfers, and burial registries. Nothing matched. It was as if these individuals had never existed outside the facility itself. Some historians believe they were relocated under new identities. Others argue they were never intended to leave. Neither explanation can be confirmed. The survivor who never aged became an internal myth among intelligence circles, not a legend, but a cautionary reference, a reminder that some data points should not be pursued too aggressively. Files referencing this individual were repeatedly reclassified at higher security levels, then vanished entirely, not destroyed, removed. In the 1970s and 1980s, advances in genetics and cellular biology revived interest in longevity research. Publicly, these studies focused on disease prevention and aging-related decline. Privately, classified programs revisited earlier hypotheses about cellular stabilization under extreme conditions. The language had changed, the ambition had not. Ethics boards expanded, regulations tightened, yet the fundamental question remained unresolved. If it is possible to extend human biological limits, who decides how far is too far?
The Third Reich had answered that question without restraint. The modern world answered it with silence. Some sealed facilities were never fully dismantled. After the war, several underground sites were deemed too unstable or contaminated to explore safely. They were sealed, reinforced, and forgotten. Decades later, geological surveys detected voids beneath populated areas, remnants of laboratories no one officially remembered building. History left physical scars beneath the surface. When fragments of these locations are rediscovered, responses are swift and controlled. Access is restricted, findings are classified, public explanations cite structural hazards or unexploded ordnance. Rarely is research mentioned. The pattern persists because it works. The experiments the Third Reich tried to erase from history were never about immortality or superhumans. They were about thresholds, how far the human system could be pushed before breaking, and what happened if it did not break as expected. Those questions remain relevant. Modern science prefers incremental progress, controlled trials, peer review, transparency. But beneath that structure exists a parallel world of classified research, driven by national security and strategic advantage. In that world, history's erased experiments are not forgotten. They are referenced quietly, cautiously, and without attribution. What makes the Third Reich's erased experiments unique is not their cruelty, history is filled with that, but their ambition. They sought to redefine human limitation itself, and when that ambition collapsed, it was buried rather than confronted. Because confronting it would require admitting that progress without restraint leads somewhere dangerous. The survivor who never aged may never be identified. The 63 may never be accounted for. The facilities may remain sealed forever. But the implications of those experiments endure, quietly shaping how far modern science is willing or unwilling to go. History often presents itself as resolved. Wars end, regimes fall. But unresolved knowledge does not disappear. It waits. The experiments the Third Reich tried to erase from history were not erased because they failed. They were erased because they succeeded enough to frighten everyone who inherited them. And that fear still governs what we are allowed to know.